Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward. Tell me, when the snow falls silent outside your window, does it ever feel as though something unseen is unfolding within the house itself? Watson once passed such a night snowbound within 4 locked walls, where a single paper vanished and only patient reason could recover it. Do subscribe, and find us as well on the Watson's Margins Spotify channel, the link waiting for you in the description below. Now draw nearer the fire, for even the quietest silence, Holmes believed, has something yet to confess. Chapter 1. The Snow at Black Tor Inn. Looking back across the long catalogue of adventures which I have been privileged to share with my friend Sherlock Holmes, I find that the cases which linger longest in memory are not always those attended by violence or by any menace to life and limb. Some of the most curious problems that ever engaged his singular faculties arose from circumstances of the utmost tranquillity, in which no blood was spilled and no pistol drawn, and yet in which the disappearance of a single sheet of paper threatened to work more mischief than any dagger. Such was the strange affair of the Intercepted bail warrant, which began, as I recall it, upon a bitter evening in January, when Holmes and I found ourselves stranded by the weather in a remote corner of Devonshire. We had been travelling from Exeter, where Holmes had been consulted upon a trifling matter of forged banknotes, and had intended to press on that same night to Plymouth, where a further engagement awaited him. But the sky, which had threatened all afternoon, broke at last into a snowstorm of such ferocity that our driver, a taciturn man well acquainted with the moor, declared that to continue would be madness. We were, he informed us, some 2 miles from the nearest village, but scarcely half a mile from an inn known as the Black Tor, kept by a decent fellow named Reed, where we might find shelter until the road could be cleared. Holmes, who dislikes nothing so much as an interruption to his plans, nevertheless bowed to the necessity with better grace than I had expected. "There is no arguing with a Devonshire snowstorm, Watson," said he, drawing his collar higher about his ears. "We shall make the best of Mr. Reed's hospitality, and I do not doubt that even an inn upon the moor may furnish some small study in human nature to reward us for the delay." He spoke more truly than he knew. The Black Tor Inn proved to be a low, stone-built house of considerable age, its windows glowing warmly through the driving snow, and its tap-room, when we entered, stiff with the peculiar civility of strangers thrown together by misfortune. We were by no means the only travellers detained. Some 7 or 8 persons had already taken refuge there, and Mr. Jonas Reed, the innkeeper, a stout and anxious man plainly unused to so full a house, moved among them with an air of one determined that his reputation should not suffer for the weather's caprice. There was Mr. Septimus Vale, a solicitor of some 50 years, precise in dress and manner, who carried with him a leather case of legal papers which he guarded with the unconscious care of a man long accustomed to confidential business. There was Miss Eleanor Harrow, a young woman of gentle bearing, evidently a governess, who sat somewhat apart with a book she did not read. Major Ransom, a retired officer with a stiff leg and a stiffer manner, occupied the chair nearest the fire as though rank conferred upon him a natural right to warmth. Dr. Lysander Pike, a country physician of cheerful disposition, engaged the Major in conversation upon the prospects of the road. Mrs. Fenwick, a widow of dignified and composed appearance, sat with a small locked writing case upon her knee, from which she seemed unwilling to be parted even for a moment, and there was besides a certain Mr. Abel Trench, a thin, nervous young man in the plain dress of a bailiff's clerk, who started at every opening of the door and kept a leather dispatch wallet close beside his chair. I confess that I saw in this gathering nothing beyond the ordinary company one might expect to find at any wayside inn in a storm. But Holmes, I observed, was not so easily satisfied. He had seated himself unobtrusively near the fire, and while he appeared to attend to nothing in particular, his eyes moved continually from one face to another, and more than once I caught him studying not the countenances of our fellow guests, but their boots, their gloves, and the manner in which each held himself when the talk, as it presently did, turned upon the law. It was Dr. Pike, I think, who first remarked upon the strange power of an official paper to alter a man's fortune, observing that he had known a patient's whole future decided by the wording of a single document. Mr. Vale agreed, with the dry satisfaction of a man upon his own ground, and spoke at some length upon the sanctity of legal process. Major Ransom grunted that the law was too often a shield for rogues. Mrs. Fenwick said nothing, but I noticed that her hand tightened upon the writing case in her lap. At the mention of the county jail, which arose I know not how in the general talk, I observed a curious stillness fall upon the room, a silence of the kind that follows when several persons at once determine to say nothing at all. Holmes, seated in the shadow of the settle, seemed almost asleep, and yet I knew him too well to be deceived by that appearance. When at last we retired, the storm still howling without, he detained me a moment upon the stair. "Watson," said he quietly, "did you remark young Trench's wallet?" "I saw that he kept it close by him," said I, "closer than a man keeps his dinner, and no farther than his own right hand. There is something in that wallet, Watson, which is worth more to somebody than its owner yet suspects. I think we shall not find this storm so tedious as our driver feared." I laughed at what I took for one of his fancies, and went to my bed little dreaming how soon his words would be proved true, nor how strange and how ingenious would prove the theft that the night was even then preparing to disclose. Chapter 2. The Prisoner at Larkmoor Jail. I woke the next morning to a white and silent world, the snow having ceased in the small hours, but left behind it a depth sufficient to bury the road entirely from view. Holmes was already dressed and standing at the window of our shared chamber, watching the grey light spread slowly over the moor. "You're an early riser this morning," said I. "I have been listening to the Housewake, Watson, which is often more instructive than watching it by daylight. Come down. I believe our young friend Trench has something upon his mind that he can no longer keep to himself." We found the tap-room already astir. Mr. Reed was distributing tea and apology in equal measure, lamenting that no coach could possibly reach us before the following noon, while several of the guests exchanged the resigned civilities of persons condemned to one another's company for another day. It was Abel Trench, however, who drew my attention, for he sat apart at the small table nearest the door, his dispatch wallet upon his knee, his face pale with an anxiety he made no great effort to conceal. Holmes seated himself beside the young clerk with an ease that seemed to invite confidence, and it was not long before the story came out, encouraged by a question or two put so naturally that Trench scarcely seemed aware he was being drawn. He was carrying, he told us, a bail warrant of the utmost urgency, made out for the release of one Adrian Lyle, a young land agent presently confined in Larkmoor Jail, upon a charge of fraud. The warrant must be delivered by noon upon the following day, for Lyle was required to give evidence in a dispute concerning the inheritance of the Harrowden estate, and should the warrant arrive too late, the opposing party would proceed unchallenged, and Lyle's testimony would be rendered worthless. "It is a heavy responsibility for one so young," Holmes observed. "I did not choose it, sir," said Trench with a touch of resentment. "My employer was taken ill, and the warrant must go forward regardless. I have carried it these 2 days, and I confess I shall be glad to be rid of it." I noticed, as he spoke, that a certain quietness had fallen upon the room, though the conversation about us continued outwardly unchanged. Mr. Vale, the solicitor, remarked, without looking up from his newspaper, that he believed he had once seen young Lyle give evidence in a minor matter at Exeter, and found him plausible enough for a rogue. Major Ransom, warming himself as before at the fire, pronounced Lyle a clever young rascal, and no better than he should be, in the tone of a man who considers the subject closed. Mrs. Fenwick, bent over some needlework, observed with quiet composure that the law's delays were sometimes a mercy, since they spared society the embarrassment of scandal too hastily aired. Miss Harrow alone said nothing at all, though I saw her eyes lift for a moment from her book and fix themselves upon the fire with an expression I could not readily interpret. Holmes said little during these exchanges, but I knew that quietness in him for what it was, the stillness of a hunting creature that has caught a scent. When Trench had gone to see about the fire in the private parlour, My friend turned to me with a light in his eye that I had come to recognise. "You observe, Watson, that the room grows quieter whenever this Lyle's name is mentioned, and that each person hastens to supply an opinion of him without being asked. That is not the silence of indifference." "You think one of them knows him?" "I think several of them know him a great deal better than they wish us to suppose, but let us not run ahead of our facts. We have at present nothing but a warmth of manner and a coolness of subject, which might mean anything or nothing." The snow, far from relenting, began again before midday, driving hard against the small windows and piling in drifts against the door of the stable, so that the ostler was obliged to dig a path merely to reach the horses. The covered passage connecting the stable to the house remained, Reed assured us, the only means of egress, all else being sealed by drift and frost. It was plain that we should be prisoners of the weather for at least another night, a circumstance which seemed to please no one so little as Trench himself, who grew visibly more restless as the short winter day wore on. At supper that evening the talk turned again, as it seemed unable to help doing, upon the subject of the Harrowden inheritance, and I observed Holmes watching the wallet which Trench had set upon the bench beside him, watching it, indeed, rather more closely than he watched the faces of the company. Once, when Trench rose to fetch his coat from the passage, Holmes's eyes followed the wallet itself, left for perhaps half a minute unguarded upon the bench, and I saw him note, with that swift and silent attention which missed nothing, the exact position in which it lay. Later, when the guests had begun to seek their rooms, or such makeshift beds as the crowded inn afforded, Holmes drew me aside near the hearth, where the fire had burned low, and a small patch of melted snow, tracked in by someone's boot, still glistened faintly upon the flagstones. "Mark that clock, Watson," said he, nodding toward the tall case clock in the corner. "And mark, too, that wallet, and this hearth, and the manner in which our friend Trench guards his charge like a mother her infant. I do not know what will happen tonight, but I have a strong suspicion that something will, and that when it does, we shall find the truth a good deal stranger than the theft of a mere piece of paper would suggest." I confess, I laughed a little at what seemed to me an excess of caution over so simple a matter, and went up to bed persuaded that my friend's restless mind had, for once, found less to occupy it than it supposed. I was to learn before another hour had passed how greatly I had underestimated the night that lay before us. Chapter 3. The Vanishing of the Warrant. I was roused from sleep, I judged, somewhat after 1 o'clock, by a commotion below stairs that no man could have slept through. Doors were flung open along the passage, and above the general confusion I heard the voice of Abel Trench raised in a pitch of distress that told me, before I had so much as found my slippers, that his fears of the previous evening had not been idle ones. Holmes was ahead of me on the stair, moving with that swift economy of motion which I had seen him employ upon a dozen occasions of urgency, and by the time I reached the tap-room the whole household had gathered there in various states of undress, Mr. Reed foremost among them with a lamp held high, his face a study in mingled alarm and outrage that such a scene should occur beneath his respectable roof. Trench stood by the settle where he had made his bed, his dispatch wallet open upon the seat before him, and it wanted no great skill in observation to see that he was telling the truth when he declared, in a voice unsteady with shock, that the bail warrant was gone. "I locked it within not 2 hours since," he protested to no one in particular. "I have not stirred from this room, gentlemen, I give you my word. I fell asleep, I own it freely, but the wallet was beneath my own arm, and now it is empty." Holmes, meanwhile, had begun a swift but thorough examination of the room, and I observed that he moved with none of the haste which agitated the rest of the company, but rather with a deliberate care, as though each object in that firelit chamber held for him a significance invisible to the ordinary eye. He tried the outer door and found it, as Reed had already sworn, barred securely from within. He passed to the windows, small and deep-set, and satisfied himself that the frost upon them lay unbroken, a delicate lacework that no hand could have disturbed without leaving evidence of the fact. He went even so far as to step into the covered passage leading to the stable, returning within a few minutes to report in a low aside to me that the only footprints there were old ones, half filled with fresh snow and plainly the stable boys. "No one has come in from without, Watson," said he, "and no one, so far as these signs will tell us, has gone out. Whatever has become of that warrant, it has not left this house by any door or window that the storm has not sealed as securely as a tomb." The wallet itself he examined with particular attention, turning it over beneath the lamp, running his long fingers along the forced clasp, which had been sprung but not broken, and remarking that the other papers within, a bundle of ordinary legal correspondence, had been left entirely undisturbed. Only the warrant, folded as it had been in a stiff sheet of official blue paper, was missing. The guests, roused from their beds and huddled in coats and shawls against the chill, offered between them a chorus of comfortable theories. Mr. Vale suggested, with the confidence of a man accustomed to being believed, that Trench had very likely mislaid the document among his other papers, and would find it by daylight. Major Ransom growled that a draught from the chimney might easily have carried a loose paper into the fire, an explanation which Dr. Pike received with a doctor's scepticism, but did not trouble to dispute. Mrs. Fenwick, drawing her shawl about her with quiet dignity, ventured that perhaps the warrant had never truly been in the wallet at all, a suggestion which Trench received with such indignant astonishment that I judged it at least to be unjust. Holmes listened to each of these explanations with the same courteous and unrevealing attention, but I, who knew him, could see that he set no store by any of them. When at length the company had begun to disperse, persuaded that little more could be done until morning, he asked me to remain and observe the room precisely as it stood, touching nothing, while he completed his examination. It was then that he drew my notice to 3 matters which I confess I should myself have passed over without a second glance. The first was the candle upon the small table beside the settle, which had burned low during the night, and down whose side the wax had run and hardened, not evenly, but pooled heavily upon one flank, as though the candle had stood at an angle for some part of its burning, and had afterward been set upright again. The second was the wallet itself, which Holmes now lifted once more and turned so that the lamp fell full upon its underside. There, plain enough when one knew to look for it, was a faint darkening of the leather, a dampness quite distinct from the dry and dusty surface of the table upon which it had lain. The third was the tall clock in the corner, which Holmes consulted against his own watch, and found to be 7 minutes slow, a discrepancy trifling in itself, yet one which he noted with evident satisfaction, remarking that Trench and the innkeeper had both fixed the hour of the disturbance with a precision which the clock itself could not support. 3 small facts, Watson, said he, when the room was empty and the fire had sunk to embers, and none of them, I grant you, would trouble a jury for a moment, but taken together they whisper of something more curious than a simple theft in the night. I think we shall find that this warrant did not vanish when our friend Trench believes it did, nor perhaps even from where he believes it vanished. The police, Reed informed us glumly, could not possibly reach us before the road was cleared, a matter of another day at the least. Holmes received this news with something very like satisfaction, and I understood, not for the first time, that he had already, in that quiet and unhurried fashion of his, taken the whole conduct of the inquiry into his own hands. Chapter 4. An Impossible Theft. By the grey light of morning the events of the night before had lost none of their strangeness, and had gained, if anything, a further measure of confusion. Holmes had risen before the rest of the house, and I found him standing in the tap-room with his hands clasped behind him, surveying the settle and the cold hearth, as a general might survey a battlefield upon which the enemy had contrived to leave no trace of his passage. "Let us set out the facts as they stand, Watson," said he when I joined him, "for I find that a case grows no clearer by being carried about loosely in the mind. The warrant was seen safe in the wallet after supper, by Trench's own hand and by no fewer than 2 others who glimpsed it when he opened the wallet to show Mr. Vale a receipt. Trench then slept in this room, having been given no bed elsewhere, the house being full, He swears, and I'm inclined for the moment to believe him, that the wallet never left his side, resting beneath his arm as he slept. The doors were barred, the windows were sealed by frost undisturbed. No stranger entered, and no one, so far as the snow will tell us, departed. Which leaves only the guests themselves, said I. Precisely so. Either Trench has not told us the whole truth, which is always possible in a young man anxious to excuse his own carelessness, or one of these very respectable persons who supped with us last evening has practised a deception requiring no small degree of coolness and skill. It was at this point that the stable boy, a freckled lad named Willett, came to read with a piece of information that set the household by the ears afresh. He had, he said, been abroad shortly after midnight to see to a restless mare, and had observed, or believed he had observed, a figure moving near the covered passage that joined the stable to the house. Pressed for a description, he named, with the reluctant honesty of a boy who fears to give offence to his betters, Major Ransom. The Major, summoned to account for himself, received the accusation with a stiffness that seemed more the product of wounded pride than of guilt. He did not deny that he had risen in the night, explaining with some embarrassment that his old wound troubled him cruelly in cold weather, and that he had walked a little in the passage to ease the ache in his leg, a habit acquired, he said, during his years in India. He denied absolutely that he had entered the common room, or that he had gone near Trench's wallet, and he seemed genuinely astonished to learn that suspicion had settled upon him at all. It was Dr. Pike, who, in the course of examining the Major's boots at Holmes's request, remarked that his military cloak was damp at the hem, a fact which the Major had not troubled to explain, and which lent a certain colour to Willett's story. For a moment, I confess, I believed the matter settled. Holmes, however, took up the cloak himself and studied the dampened hem with an attention that seemed disproportionate to so simple a fact. He touched the fabric, rubbed a fold of it between finger and thumb, and even, to my considerable astonishment, touched it lightly to his tongue. "This is clean snowmelt, Watson," said he quietly, "such as one gathers from brushing against banked snow in the open passage. It is not the muddy slush that lies thick about the stable door, through which any man walking to observe a restless mare must necessarily have passed. The Major's story and the dampness of his cloak agree very well together. It is Willett's story that wants confirming." Pressed further, the boy admitted with growing uncertainty that he had not in truth seen the Major's face, but only a figure and a halting step in the darkness of the passage, and that he had assumed the rest. Holmes remarked afterward, in a tone I might almost have called amused, that the Major's limp, real enough in the man himself, had been imitated that night with more confidence than accuracy by some other person moving in the passage, though he would not yet say by whom. Suspicion, thus loosened from the Major, fastened next upon Miss Harrow, for I had myself observed and mentioned to Holmes a faint staining of ink upon 2 fingers of her right hand. Questioned upon the point, she answered readily enough that she had sat up late writing a letter to her sister, a natural and unremarkable occupation, and one which Mrs. Fenwick, seated beside her, confirmed having witnessed before retiring. Holmes accepted the explanation without visible objection, yet asked, almost as an afterthought, whether he might see the sheet of blotting paper she had used. Miss Harrow produced it without hesitation, and Holmes studied it for some moments beneath the window, turning it this way and that against the light, though he offered no remark upon what, if anything, he had found there. By midday the household had settled, with evident relief, upon the comfortable theory that some person unknown had slipped into the common room during a moment's inattention and made off with the warrant before hiding themselves again among the general confusion of a crowded and storm-bound inn. It was a theory that asked little of anyone's imagination and accused no one in particular, and I could see that it was rapidly hardening in the minds of Reed and his other guests into settled fact. Holmes heard this conclusion pronounced, by Mr. Vale among others, with the same courteous patience he had shown throughout the morning, but when the company had dispersed to their several occupations, he turned to me with a faint dry smile that I had learned to associate with his profoundest disagreements. "Convenient, Watson," said he, "but not yet intelligent. A theory that satisfies everyone's comfort and troubles. No one's conscience is generally the least likely to satisfy the facts. We have a locked house, an untouched party of guests, and a vanished paper, and I promise you that when we have finished, we shall find that the true explanation was standing in plain view from the very first evening, waiting only for someone to look at it without prejudice." He would say no more that day, though I observed him twice return, apparently without purpose, to stand before the cold hearth where the small patch of melted snow had by now entirely dried away, leaving no mark at all upon the flagstone save in his own exacting memory. Chapter 5. What was seen, not said. Holmes spent the greater part of that afternoon in a manner which struck Reed, and I think most of the household besides, as curiously indirect for a man supposedly investigating a theft. Rather than pressing the guests upon their movements or their motives, he drew each of them, in turn, and with an appearance of idle conversation, into a discussion of what they had happened to observe of one another during the previous evening. "You will notice, Watson," said he to me quietly, as we waited for Mr. Vale to finish some business with his papers before submitting to examination, "that a man will guard his own account with the greatest care, and yet will speak with perfect freedom of what he noticed in his neighbour. It is in these small, careless observations, offered without suspicion of their own importance, that the truth generally lies concealed." Mr. Vale, when his turn came, proved a ready witness upon this point, if upon little else. He recalled distinctly that Mrs. Fenwick had risen from the parlour some minutes before supper was announced, an absence he remembered only because she had left her needlework upon the arm of her chair. Mrs. Fenwick, questioned in her turn, remembered with equal clarity that Miss Harrow had stood for some time by the fire that evening, warming her hands in a manner she thought unusual in one who had but lately come in from the cold passage. Miss Harrow, appealed to, recalled that Dr. Pike had examined Trench's chest that same evening, the young clerk having complained of a cough brought on, as he supposed by the change of weather, and Dr. Pike, last of the four, remembered chiefly that Major Ransom had inquired of him, with some anxiety, whether the road to the jail was likely to clear by morning, a question the Major had put more than once in the course of the evening. I confess that I found in this chain of small recollections nothing that seemed to advance us a single step, and said as much to Holmes when we had withdrawn to the window seat to consider what we had learned. "You are looking for a fact, Watson, when you should be looking for a habit," said he. "Facts may be manufactured or forgotten, but a habit betrays a man before he is even aware that he has spoken." And indeed, as the day wore on, Holmes seemed less concerned with what each guest had done than with the small, unconsidered manner in which each of them did everything. He observed that Mr. Vale, asked a hand across a paper, folded it lengthwise before doing so, in the particular manner of a man long trained to the forms of legal business. He noted that Mrs. Fenwick, though she guarded her writing case with a watchfulness that never relaxed, left a small brooch of some value lying carelessly upon the mantel, as though jewellery held for her no interest beside whatever the locked case contained. He remarked that Dr. Pike, questioned closely upon the state of Trench's health, answered with a physician's precision, yet seemed entirely blind to the undercurrents of tension that ran so plainly beneath the surface of the household. He noticed that Major Ransom, mild enough under direct accusation, dropped his voice to something near a whisper whenever the name of Adrian Lyle chanced to arise, though he spoke loudly enough upon every other subject. And he observed that Miss Harrow had a habit, before answering any question however trivial, of glancing first at the face of whoever else was in the room, as though she measured the danger of her reply before she ventured it. It was in the course of this quiet, patient study that Holmes made his way once more to the hearth, and there, raking gently among the cold ashes with a pair of fire-irons, he drew out a small fragment of paper, scorched black along one edge, yet bearing still upon its unburned portion a scrap of official blue such as I had seen used for legal documents. Reed, summoned to look upon it, declared at once, with evident relief, that here was the explanation of the whole mystery, the warrant having plainly fallen or been thrown into the fire and there consumed. Holmes turned the fragment over in his long fingers beneath the window light for some little while before he spoke. "You will observe, Reed, that the torn edge here is remarkably clean. Cleaner, I think, than paper commonly tears when snatched in haste or carried by a draught. And the burned edge here is neat also, neater than the ragged blackening one generally finds where a whole sheet has caught and curled in an open fire. I do not say it is impossible that this fragment came here by accident. I say only that it is a good deal more likely to have been placed." "Placed, Mr. Holmes?" Reed's broad face creased with bewilderment. "But who would trouble to plant so small a scrap? And to what purpose?" "To the purpose, I fancy, of persuading us that the warrant is destroyed, and that our search may therefore cease," said Holmes. "It is a very economical form of deception, requiring nothing more than a torn corner and a moment's opportunity by an unwatched hearth. That evening, as we sat together over a modest supper, I found myself turning the day's small observations over in my mind, and remarked to Holmes that I could see no thread connecting them into any coherent pattern. "Nor should you yet, Watson," said he with a faint smile, "for we have been asking the wrong question from the very beginning. We have asked who hated Adrian Lyle enough to wish him kept from that courtroom. It is a natural question, and it has yielded us nothing but suspicion scattered evenly among 6 respectable persons who are, I do not doubt, all entirely capable of disliking a man without stealing a warrant on his account. The question we ought to have asked is a narrower one. Who needed him detained, not from malice, but from necessity, for one single day, and no longer?" He would say nothing further that night save to observe, as he knocked out his pipe before retiring, that the fire had told him more than any tongue in the house had yet ventured to confess. Chapter 6. The Silent Agreement. The third day of our confinement at the Black Tor Inn dawned no less white than the 2 before it, though Reed brought word at breakfast that the road might, with good fortune, be passable by the following noon. Holmes received this news with a curious lack of urgency, remarking only that he trusted the warrant, wherever it presently lay, would keep as well as the road. He had, I found, spent some part of the earlier morning in quiet conversation with each of our fellow guests in turn, not upon the matter of the theft directly, but upon their own histories and connections, a subject he introduced with such apparent idleness that I do not think above 1 or 2 of them suspected they were being examined at all. By the time he had finished, he possessed a chain of facts which, taken singly, might have seemed no more than the ordinary intersections of a small county society, but which, taken together, formed a pattern he was not slow to point out to me. Miss Harrow Watson was once governess in the household at Harrowden itself, some 3 years since, before the present dispute over the estate had so much as been imagined. Major Ransom, it appears, served for a time as one of the trustees appointed under the old squire's will. Mr. Vale, by his own admission, prepared certain of the very documents now in question in the inheritance suit, and Mrs. Fenwick's late husband, I am reliably informed by Dr. Pike, held investments in lands adjoining the estate, investments whose value depends a good deal upon which way the present dispute is decided. "Then each of them has a reason to fear what this young Lyle might say," said I, beginning at last to see the shape of what had puzzled me. "Each of them has a reason to fear it, yes, though I would caution you against supposing that fear and guilt are the same coin merely because they are often minted together. I have watched this household closely these 3 days, Watson, and I tell you plainly that I believe most of these good people to be frightened rather than criminal. There is a silence among them, a kind of unspoken compact, in which no one will be the first to speak lest speaking cast suspicion upon himself. It is the silence of shared apprehension, not of shared guilt, and the 2, though they wear the same face, are very different creatures beneath the skin. It was in the course of that same morning that Holmes turned his attention to a matter which had, until then, escaped my own notice entirely, namely the small brass bell that hung above the mantel in the common room, connected by a wire to a larger bell in the kitchen passage, by which guests might summon the servants at need. Questioning Reed upon the point, Holmes learned that this bell had indeed been rung during the night of the theft, at some time which the innkeeper judged to be about 12:30, though he could not swear to the hour with any exactness, the sound having reached him only faintly through the closed door of his own chamber, and the general roar of the storm without. Trench, appealed to, protested with some heat that he had slept soundly from shortly after midnight until nearly 2, and had neither rung the bell himself nor heard it ring, a claim which Reed did not dispute, observing only that the storm had been loud enough that night to drown a cannon, let alone so small a bell as theirs. "A bell rung, and no one to answer it," said Holmes thoughtfully, when we had withdrawn from this conversation. "That is a curious economy, Watson, to summon a servant who cannot possibly come, unless, of course, the ringing served some purpose quite apart from summoning anyone at all." He returned once more that afternoon to the burned fragment of blue paper which he had drawn from the hearth the day before, and subjected the ashes about it to a more thorough examination than his first hurried search had allowed. He found among them, he told me, a quantity of fine grey ash, quite consistent with the burning of an old newspaper, several half-charred fragments, of which yet remained near the back of the grate. But the blue fragment itself, when he examined it closely beneath his lens, bore no trace of that same fine ash clinging to its scorched edge, as it must surely have done had it burned in that same fire at that same time. It was burned elsewhere, Watson, or burned earlier, and only afterward laid among these ashes to be found," said he. "Whoever placed it here took considerable care over a very small deception, which is generally, in my experience, a sign that the deception was meant to serve a larger purpose than its size would suggest. I confess that my own suspicions, as the day drew toward its close, had settled with some firmness upon young Trench himself, whose anxiety throughout our confinement had struck me as excessive even in a man burdened with so weighty a charge, and I said as much to Holmes as we sat together after supper. "He is concealing something. I do not doubt it," Holmes admitted, filling his pipe with the slow deliberation that always preceded his more considered judgments. "But concealment, Watson, is not the same coin as guilt, any more than fear is. A man may hide a great deal from simple embarrassment or from loyalty misplaced, without having committed the act that troubles him to hide." He fell silent then, his eyes half closed against the fire, and when he spoke again it was to ask, apparently at random, how long a man might carry a folded paper from the common room to the small private parlour where Mrs. Fenwick kept her writing case, and by what route he might do so without being seen from either the kitchen passage or the stair. I could give him no useful answer, knowing the house as little as I did, but I saw that some new line of thought had opened before him, one which he pursued in silence for the remainder of that evening, tracing with his eye, again and again, the short distance between the hearth where Trench had slept and the closed door of the parlour beyond. Chapter 7. The Discovery in the Chimney. The fourth morning of our confinement brought no relief from the storm, for although the snow itself had ceased to fall, a hard wind had risen in the night and thrown up such drifts across the moor road that Reed pronounced it, with a heaviness of spirit that had by now become habitual to him, quite as impassable as before. It was in the midst of the general gloom occasioned by this news that Dr. Pike, who had taken it upon himself to search the private parlour for a missing spectacle case of his own, gave a sudden exclamation that brought the household running. He had found, wedged behind a loose brick at the side of the parlour chimney, a folded paper, blackened a little at one corner, as though it had lain near enough to some fire to be scorched, yet whole and legible enough to be read. It was, upon examination, the bail warrant for the release of Adrian Lyle. For a moment the relief in that small room was general and unfeigned. Trench seized upon the paper with something very near to tears, and Reed declared that the whole unhappy business might now be laid to rest, the document being found and no great harm done beyond a few days' fright. Holmes alone did not share in the general rejoicing. He took the paper from Trench's hands with a courteous but firm insistence, and studied it beneath the window for some minutes, in a silence that gradually communicated itself to the rest of us. "This is not the warrant that was taken from your wallet," said he at last, and the words fell upon that cheerful little gathering like a stone into still water. He pointed out, when pressed, the particulars upon which his judgment rested. The seal impressed upon the document, though a tolerable imitation, lacked the fine irregularity of an original stamp worn by long service, and showed instead the crisp, unweathered edge of an impression newly cut. The fold marks, moreover, ran contrary to the creases visible in the leather of Trench's wallet, where the true warrant had lain for 2 days and more, a discrepancy which Holmes demonstrated by laying the paper directly against the worn lining. And the wording itself, he said, contained one legal phrase, employed in describing the nature of the surety, which no county clerk of his acquaintance would have used, but which a solicitor drafting from memory, an imperfect memory at that, might very easily supply. The suspicion which this discovery threw upon Mr. Vale was immediate, and, I thought, not unreasonable, for who among that company possessed the professional skill to draft so convincing a counterfeit save a man trained to the law? Vale himself, confronted with Holmes's observations, grew first indignant, then, under the steady pressure of question after patient question, subdued into a kind of weary candour. He admitted that he had indeed copied the warrant, having glimpsed it in Trench's wallet on the first evening when the young clerk had opened it to find a receipt, and having been struck, he said, by professional curiosity as to its precise wording, in a matter of a local interest. He swore, with what I judged to be genuine feeling, that he had taken only a copy for his own private study, and had never touched the original, nor had any notion how his copy came to be hidden in the parlour chimney. It was at this point, while the household still absorbed the strangeness of Vale's confession, that Miss Harrow rose from her chair with a composure that seemed to cost her a considerable effort, and declared, in a low but steady voice, that she herself had taken the original warrant from Trench's wallet. Her reason, she said, was neither theft nor malice in the ordinary sense, but a bitterness 3 years old. Adrian Lyle, she told us, had once brought ruin upon her own family by some dealing she would not fully explain, and she had acted, upon seeing the wallet unguarded, in a moment of passion she had since bitterly regretted. She had burned a corner of the paper in the parlour fire, she said, meaning to destroy it entirely, but her courage had failed her, and she had hidden it instead behind the loose brick where she had hoped it would never be found. It was, I confess, a confession that moved me a good deal, delivered as it was with every appearance of painful sincerity, and I saw that Reed and the others received it with the ready sympathy that a plausible sorrow generally commands. Only Holmes remained unmoved, listening to her account with the same close attention he had given to every fact of the case, yet offering neither comfort nor accusation when she had finished. "You will forgive me, Miss Harrow," said he at last, with a gentleness that somewhat softened the substance of what he said, "if I confess that your account, however keenly felt, does not entirely satisfy me." She asked him, with evident surprise, what fault he could possibly find with a confession so freely and so painfully given. "None in your feeling, I'm sure," said Holmes, "but a good deal in its mechanism. There is, if I may say so, too much pain in what you have told us, and too little of the particular. A woman capable of the cool and exact deception this theft required, the forced clasp, the untouched other papers, the fire fed just enough to scorch and no further, does not commonly betray herself, 3 days later, in tears at the first opportunity of doing so." It was a remark that silenced the room more effectively than any accusation could have done, and I saw upon more than one face about me the first uneasy suspicion that the matter, far from being closed, had scarcely yet begun to open. Chapter 8. The Wrong Conclusion strengthens. Whatever doubts Holmes had raised by his quiet objection, they did not long survive the general relief that Miss Harrow's confession had brought to the household. By that same evening I could see that the greater part of our fellow guests, and Reed most of all, had settled comfortably upon the conclusion that the mystery, however sad in its particulars, was substantially resolved. A young woman wronged, a moment of passion, a theft regretted almost as soon as committed, a false copy made from motives no worse than professional vanity, and a fragment burned in a fit of remorse and then hidden rather than destroyed outright. All this formed a chain of events plausible enough to satisfy minds already wearied by 3 days of confinement and eager to think well of one another again. Holmes, to my very great surprise, did nothing to disturb this comfortable settlement. He answered such questions as were put to him with a courteous vagueness quite unlike his usual precision, and when Major Ransom remarked, not without a touch of condescension, that the affair had proved rather simpler than a person of Holmes's reputation might have found satisfying, my friend only smiled and allowed that he had perhaps expected a more intricate puzzle than the facts had ultimately supplied. "You're not persuaded, surely," said I, when we had withdrawn to a quiet corner of the tap-room. "Persuaded of what, Watson? That Miss Harrow lied to protect herself? Not for one moment. But I have found it a useful thing, upon occasion, to permit a household to settle into a false security while I continue my own inquiries, beneath the surface of its comfort. A watched suspect is a guarded one, but a company convinced that all danger is past will very often show you, quite unknowingly, the one fact that a state of alarm would have kept hidden." He would say no more of his reasoning that evening, save to remark, when we had gone up to our room, that Miss Harrow's account contained a single flaw of mechanism which no passion, however genuine, could explain away. She had told us, he reminded me, that she had opened the wallet and taken the warrant while Trench slept soundly upon the settle, the wallet lying, as it always did, beneath his arm. But the wallet itself, examined that very first night, had shown upon its underside a dampness quite distinct from the dry surface of the table, a dampness which could only have come from its having lain, at some point, upon a wet surface, and no such surface existed near the settle where Trench slept. The wallet was not on his person when the exchange occurred, Watson. It was somewhere else, somewhere damp, and it was returned to his side afterward, so smoothly that he never woke to know it had gone. He spent the whole of the following morning, while the household busied itself with the small comforts of another day's confinement, in a silent and solitary reconstruction of the scene, moving about the tap-room with a candle, the wallet itself, borrowed once more from Trench upon some pretext I did not fully catch, and a small tin cup of water which he used, I gathered, to represent the melted snow that had once lain glistening upon the hearth. I watched him set the candle upon the small table, observe the angle at which its light fell across the settle, then move it and observe again. I watched him kneel upon the flagstones before the fire, measuring with his eye the distance between the hearth and the door of the private parlour, where Mrs. Fenwick's writing-case had lain. And I watched him consult, more than once, the tall clock in the corner, whose 7 minutes of tardiness he had noted upon that very first night. The theft did not happen in the darkness of 12:30, Watson. Whatever the bell would have us believe, said he at last, rising and dusting the ash from his knees. It happened far earlier, in the ordinary bustle of the evening itself, while Trench sat warming himself before supper and thought of nothing more sinister than his own comfort. What vanished in the night was not the warrant at all. The warrant was already gone by then, safely exchanged for its counterfeit some hours before. What vanished in the night was rather the last opportunity to discover that the exchange had taken place before anyone thought to look for it. I confess I did not, in that moment, fully grasp the distinction he was drawing, and said so with some frankness. Consider it thus, Watson. If a thief wishes you to believe that a theft occurred at midnight, in a locked room, under impossible conditions, he does you a very particular service. He directs the whole of your suspicion toward the impossible hour and away from the ordinary one that came before it. We have spent 3 days marvelling at how a paper could be taken from a barred house in the black of night, when the true question was never how, but when. The impossibility was manufactured, Watson, precisely because the truth beneath it was so very simple. He fell silent then, and I saw upon his face that particular stillness which I had learned, over years of friendship, to recognize as the calm that comes just before a storm of revelation. When I pressed him further, He would say only that he required one further proof before he could speak with certainty, a proof which lay, he believed, within a locked writing case that had scarcely left its owner's side since the very first evening of our confinement, and that he intended, before another day had passed, to see that case opened. Chapter 9. Holmes reconstructs the movements. Holmes moved that afternoon with a quiet decision that told me the case had, in his own mind, already reached its conclusion, and that all that now remained was the gathering of witnesses to hear what he had gathered in silence. He asked Reed to assemble the household in the tap-room before the fire, a request the innkeeper conveyed with visible apprehension, and by 4 o'clock we sat once more, the whole company together, much as we had sat upon that first civilized evening when the storm had driven us beneath his roof. Mrs. Fenwick occupied her accustomed chair near the hearth, her writing case, as ever, resting upon her knee, and it was upon this case that Holmes's eyes first rested as he began to speak. "I promised you, when we first met beneath this roof, that even a wayside inn might furnish some small study in human nature," said he. "I confess the study has proved a good deal larger than I anticipated. We have had, in these 3 days, a false confession offered from misplaced loyalty, a forged copy made from professional vanity, a fragment burned to suggest a destruction that never occurred, and a bell rung to mark an hour at which nothing whatever took place. It is a very elaborate structure, and I think it worth your patience to see how it was built." He turned then to the wallet, which lay upon the table where Trench had set it, and reminded the company of the dampness he had found upon its underside that first night, a dampness inconsistent with the dry table upon which it appeared to have rested. The wallet was not beneath Mr. Trench's arm when the warrant was taken. It had been moved briefly to the hearthstone itself, where a little melted snow yet lingered from a cloak shaken out earlier that same evening. It was there, in the ordinary bustle before supper, that the true exchange occurred, not at midnight, but while Mr. Trench warmed himself at the fire and thought his charge safe simply because it lay near at hand. I saw Trench's face grow pale at this, though whether from anger at his own carelessness or from the dawning shape of what Holmes was about to reveal, I could not then say. "Mrs. Fenwick," Holmes continued, turning now with a gravity that silenced whatever murmur had begun to rise. "It was you who spilled that snow-melt near the hearth, in appearance an accident of a heavy cloak too near the fire, but in truth the cover under which the wallet was lifted opened and its contents exchanged for a warrant already prepared and carried, folded small within the very case you hold upon your knee." She did not cry out, nor did she deny it in that first moment, but sat very still, her hands closing a little more firmly upon the case, and I understood then that Holmes had struck very near the truth. He went on, methodically, to lay bare each device by which the theft had been concealed. The candle, moved and later restored, had been shifted to alter the apparent hour of disturbance, its uneven burning a small but telling sign of interference. The bell, rung at 12:30 when no one lay near enough to answer it, had been rung to fix a false hour of crisis in the memory of a household roused from sleep and confused by the storm. The fragment of blue paper, burned elsewhere and laid among the ashes only afterward, had been planted to suggest that the warrant met its end in an act of impulsive destruction. The false copy hidden behind the loose brick, drawn from Mr. Vale's own indiscretion in copying what he had glimpsed, had been placed there to cast suspicion, when suspicion could no longer be avoided, upon the one man in the house with the skill to have forged it. "And Miss Harrow's confession," said Holmes, his voice softening as he turned to her, "was neither malice nor invention, but courage very sadly misapplied. She believed, I think, that Major Ransom had taken the warrant, moved by some old grievance she could not name, and she offered herself in his place rather than see an innocent man, as she supposed him, brought to disgrace." Miss Harrow's eyes filled, and she said nothing, but the Major, beside her, reached out and touched her hand with a gentleness that told its own story more plainly than any words could have done. Mrs. Fenwick spoke at last, her voice steady though very low. She had acted, she said, from no hatred of Adrian Lyle, whom she scarcely knew, but from fear, a fear grown old and heavy over years of silence. Her late husband, she confessed, had forged a transfer of land connected to the very Harrowden estate now in dispute, a fact which Lyle, in the course of his own inquiries as land agent, had lately uncovered. Should he reach the hearing and speak what he knew, her husband's memory, her own fortune, and the honourable engagement lately arranged for her son would all alike be ruined beyond repair. She had thought only, she said, to buy a single day, one day in which the road might remain closed and the hearing pass without him. Holmes, when she had finished, rose and crossed to where the writing case lay, now surrendered without resistance upon the table. He had noticed, he said, examining the brass corner of the case beneath the lamp, that it sat unevenly upon its hinge, as though recently loosened and refitted, and that the case itself carried a weight upon one side beyond what its ordinary contents would account for. Working the corner gently with the point of his penknife, he drew from a narrow cavity within the lining a single folded sheet of official blue paper, its seal unbroken, its creases matching precisely those long worn into the leather of Trench's wallet. The road, Reed announced within the hour, had at last begun to clear, and Holmes, with no further word of triumph, only a quiet satisfaction that I had come to know well in him, placed the true warrant in my own hands and asked that I ride with it myself upon the innkeeper's fastest horse toward Larkmoor Jail before the last of the daylight failed us. Chapter 10. The Road Opens. The ride to Larkmoor Jail remains, among all the small hardships I've endured in Holmes's service, one I recall with a certain affection, for though the cold was bitter and the road treacherous with half-melted drifts, I carried with me a document that meant quite literally the difference between justice done and justice denied. I reached the jail with perhaps 2 hours to spare before the noon deadline, and had the satisfaction of placing the warrant into the hands of the governor myself, and of seeing Adrian Lyle, a thin and anxious young man little resembling the rogue his acquaintances had painted him, led out into the winter light a free man. He gave his evidence 3 days later at the hearing upon the Harrowden inheritance, and I am told, though I did not myself attend, that his testimony proved decisive in correcting a claim that would otherwise have stood unchallenged. Of the particulars of that estate business I know little and care less, it being no concern of Holmes's investigation, which had ended, properly speaking, the moment the warrant left my hands at the jail gate. I returned to the Black Tor Inn the following day to find the roads open at last, the drifts settling into the ordinary brown slush of a Devonshire thaw, and the household in a state very different from the anxious civility of our first evening beneath that roof. Mrs. Fenwick had been taken into custody by the local constable, summoned at last through the cleared roads, and Holmes spoke of her, when the matter came up between us, without any trace of the harshness I might once have expected from him in the presence of deliberate deception. She did a wrong thing, Watson, and did it with a skill that very nearly succeeded. But I do not think she is a wicked woman by nature. She acted to preserve a respectability already built upon her husband's older sin, and I suspect she has paid, in the sleepless nights of these 3 days alone, a good part of whatever price the law will now exact from her. Major Ransom, cleared entirely of the suspicion that had briefly fallen upon him, seemed to bear no great resentment for the misunderstanding, remarking gruffly that a man who chooses to walk about a strange house at midnight must expect to be looked at askance, and that Holmes had, in fairness, righted the injustice as promptly as he had raised it. Mr. Vale's part in the affair, though embarrassing to a man of his professional standing, involved no criminal act beyond an indiscretion of curiosity, and I understood that the matter was allowed to pass without formal consequence, upon Holmes's own quiet representation to the authorities that the copying, however improper, had been no part of the true theft. Miss Harrow I saw only briefly before our departure, and found her a good deal recovered from the anguish of the days before. She thanked Holmes with a simplicity that seemed to me more affecting than any elaborate speech could have been, and Holmes, who bears such gratitude always with a certain awkwardness, told her only that her false confession, however misguided, had sprung from a loyalty he thought rather more creditable than blameworthy, and that she need not reproach herself unduly for a courage that had, in the end, harmed no one but herself. As we sat that evening in the railway carriage that carried us at last toward London, I found myself turning the whole curious business over in my mind, and remarked to Holmes that I could not but marvel at the elaborate machinery Mrs. Fenwick had constructed to conceal so simple an act. "It is very often so, Watson," said he, watching the darkening moor slip past the window. "The amateur criminal, unlike the professional, does not trust to simplicity, for simplicity requires a coolness of nerve that comes only with long practice. She built her structure of false clues, the candle, the bell, the burned fragment, the copied warrant, precisely because she did not trust the plain fact of the exchange to go unnoticed on its own merits. And in building it, she very nearly succeeded, for a household eager to believe in an impossible theft will generally find one if enough small confusions are laid before it." "And yet you were not deceived from the very first evening," said I. "I was deceived a little, I confess, by the general courtesy of the company, which inclined me, as it inclined everyone else, to look first among strangers rather than among ourselves for the source of the trouble. But a locked room, Watson, is only impossible so long as one insists upon the hour at which the impossibility is said to have occurred. Move the hour, and the impossibility very often moves with it, until it vanishes altogether into the ordinary confusion of an ordinary evening. I have set down this narrative, as I have so many others, chiefly for my own satisfaction in recalling a friend's remarkable gifts, though I confess that this case, more than most, has stayed with me for reasons beyond the mere cleverness of its solution. There was no violence in it, no pursuit through darkened streets, no pistol drawn in a moment of peril, and yet I have rarely seen Holmes apply himself with a more patient or a more humane discernment than he showed among that snowbound company at the Black Tor Inn. It depended, as he himself observed when the case was closed, upon nothing more dramatic than the ordinary human habit of trusting the most convenient moment and neglecting to examine the first one. Holmes's final words to me upon the matter, spoken as the train carried us on through the winter dust toward Paddington, have remained with me since as a fitting motto for the whole strange affair. "The impossible theft inside the locked inn," said he, "was impossible only because it had never happened there